Welcome to Field-Based Activity 4. In this activity, we're going to examine Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understand how his concepts impact students' ability to learn, as well as supports the needs for teachers to pay particular attention to these factors in educating students. Maslow's hierarchy of needs explains how not just students but all people have a series of priorities, things that are needed in order to function in life. And it begins with very basic needs, things like food, clothing, shelter, warmth, and progresses up from there into ultimately self-actualization. And students need to have their lower order primary needs fulfilled before being able to engage the higher order needs. As teachers, we need to address each of these needs as our students come. Some come with more of these needs met than others, and that impacts how we treat them and how we are able to educate them. In a review of the research on this topic of how students' needs impact their learning, Lewis has an article on redefining inexcusability. And in the article, he notes how students in poverty often lack very basic resources at home. They lack adequate food, they lack adequate shelter, they often live in homes with parents who might be mentally ill or abusing drugs, things of that nature. And he makes the point that many reformers are unwilling to recognize the problems that are created by poverty. They're unwilling to address them, and so they attempt to shift things around within schools without ever really addressing the underlying problem, which is that these students have not had their very basic needs met, and so when they come into school, they are not able to learn or prepared to learn. And so no matter what kind of reforms we undertake, if we don't deal with those issues on a societal level as well as an educational level, then those students will never be able, or will have a much more difficult time of learning at least. To help students learn, schools need to address these social and these educational concerns of students and their families. As schools and teachers particularly, we want to do that. We want to address those things as much as we can, but ultimately it is a bigger picture issue than just the school. The other source that I reviewed was a study from Australia discussing the students' readiness to learn based upon their socioeconomic level and the difficulties and the challenges that they face for students who live in poverty. And they begin with an understanding in a particular point that students need to have certain skills before entering school to be ready to learn, to be able to be schooled. And these are skills that are learned in the home and learned in the community that a student is raised in. And so, if a student is raised in a home or a community where they fend for themselves, or they're cared for by older siblings or by someone who is not a family member, oftentimes they fail to gain those skills. And so, and students in these situations, they face not only just physical poverty, but in many cases some of the more harmful things about students that come from families in poverty is that they have greater instances of mental health issues, drug and alcohol addiction with their parents and guardians, higher incidence of violence within families and within communities. And so overall, not just they haven't had basic needs, but they don't have basic emotional needs met as well. And so these challenges negatively affect the students' educational outcomes. They're coming to school having come from a life in which their primary focus is to essentially survive from day to day in terms of getting enough food, having safety and protection, and things of that nature. And so what the study did note was that the one thing that really is able to mitigate many of the physical factors of students that come from poverty is the quality of the parenting and the community resources. So that if students coming from these communities have parents who receive parenting classes, who care for their children, who raise their children and actively engage them before they come to school, they're often able to overcome many of those deficiencies that they would otherwise have. In discussing the role of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in education with my field educator, my Crystal Dunlap, she's a special education teacher. She offered a number of insights. The first was in discussion of students that come from lower socioeconomic levels, students that live in poverty. As we've noted from the research as well, many of these students come to school without many of their basic needs met, and so they come at a great disadvantage to many of their peers. And what she noted, some of the really important aspects of this, is that parents are often not involved in the students' lives. They sometimes do not provide adequate levels of care. Some of those situations can even become dangerous with students living in fear for themselves, for their siblings, and so students get to the point where they kind of live in a survival mode, and they have a difficulty switching that off, and when they come into a school and switching into learning mode. And so they struggle with that, and so it's very difficult for them to engage when they're in the classroom. And what she noted from a teacher's perspective is that it's really important to be aware of how these issues affect students. Oftentimes we see a student misbehave, or we have a difficulty with students submitting work or something of that nature, and we immediately go to a sense that this is just bad behavior, that these students are acting out, when in all reality it may be that this is merely a byproduct of the issues that they're dealing with at home, and they're dealing with in their community. And we need to be sensitive to that and try to support and help those students. Crystal also addressed some of the other areas along Maslow's hierarchy of needs that I thought was an important aspect of understanding how Maslow's hierarchy impacts us as educators. Specifically, she works as a special education teacher, and so she addressed the importance of teachers considering student self-esteem. She has found that often with special education students, when they are diagnosed, they see themselves differently. And furthermore, some of even their peers, and even, unfortunately, teachers, will see them and treat them differently. Maybe even in not a totally negative way, but just being overly paternalistic or something along those lines. And I think this is something that can be extrapolated to all students. Many students have an overwhelming fear of failure. They've come from a family, they have this sense that they're going to be a failure because of their family or their life circumstances. And this is a fear that ultimately leads them to not even try, because they would rather not try than actually have failed something. And so they're resistant to doing anything in school. And so for these students, teachers need to fill their need for self-esteem before the educational content can really be presented. And it's not a, give every kid a trophy kind of self-esteem, but rather helping the students to realize what skills they do have to help them feel empowered. And so when they are given a task, they realize that they are doing the best that they can, and they are working to their potential, and they feel empowered to, meet the needs of the classroom. And finally, I think one of the most interesting insights that Crystal had was that, the nature of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that these are what he identified were needs that every person needs and wants to be met. And if we don't find them met in a typical circumstance like our family or our community or the typical places that we would go, you're going to search out ways and places to find them. And that's certainly true for students. And she made the point that if we as a school and as teachers specifically do not provide ways for students to meet these physical, social, and emotional needs, then they're going to seek out inappropriate alternatives to meet those needs. That is in many ways why students turn to, things maybe a little bit more innocuous like cliques and belonging to very kind of specific subgroups. And more dangerously, students that come from poverty often find themselves drawn into gangs or some kind of violent subculture for literal protection. They feel the need for that protection and for providing through criminal activity for themselves and their families. And so, unfortunately, a lack of funding has eliminated many of the social aspects of school where students can be involved in, the arts, music, theater, after-school activities, even some athletic programs, especially in school districts that are very strapped for cash and, poor, often urban neighborhoods. there's a lack of that kind of thing. And so we as teachers have an opportunity through maybe even just volunteering for free for those kind of programs if we are dedicated to helping students. These kind of programs can provide students ways to meet these needs. And it provides us the opportunity to build a strong relationship with these students. And that kind of relationship built, in the theater or in the debate club or on the ball field can translate into better classroom performance for these students because they have a feeling of success, a feeling of belonging, and also the sense that you are caring for them and that you have their best interest at heart. My learning, the goals that I've taken away from this field-based activity to implement in my instruction and my work with students is I want to be sensitive to the home environments that students are coming from. As a cyber educator at PA Cyber, I have students that come from all over the state. They come from all kinds of different communities, from very urban to extremely rural. And they all have certain challenges that they come from with their different circumstances. And I think it's important for me to understand that and to realize what effects that kind of circumstance will have on their performance so that I can be a support to them. In my role as an instructional supervisor, a big part of what I do is reaching out to students and empowering them. And I want to kind of continue and push myself to do that. I want to make that effort to empower them to be successful because that's really my greatest tool and my greatest asset in the job that I have to help these students be successful. And finally, I want to become more involved in PA Cyber's on-site programs to become engaged with the students. We have a number of them and they continue to grow, and I believe that they provide a great opportunity for our students and our teachers to engage one another and to create a very collaborative and supportive environments for our students so that if we do have students coming from difficult home circumstances or living in difficult or dangerous communities, we provide an oasis for that in an environment that will help and support the students.